You dream every night. Most of those dreams you forget before sunrise. Some vanish before they even form. But every lost dream, every half-thought and faded image, goes somewhere. They drift to a quiet place deep beneath the earth, where someone waits. A god you've never heard of. A god who spends eternity sorting the dreams nobody wanted. His name is Oneiros Minor. You close your eyes, and the sound of distant waves begins to fade. It is the sound of the Aegean Sea, but quieter than you expect. The night has settled over the ancient world. Somewhere beyond the silver fog, in the dim corridors of Nyx's realm, the lesser gods of dreams stir from their long duties. The Greeks believed that dreams were sent by divine messengers. The great gods, like Zeus or Apollo, sometimes sent visions of prophecy or warning. But there were many dreams that held no message, no glory, and no purpose. The strange fragments that visit you between waking and sleep. The ones that slip away before you remember them. Those belonged to the minor god Oneiros Minor. He was not famous, not sung by poets, and not painted on vases. He did not have temples. He did not command storms or fates. His job was to manage the overflow of dreams. The scraps, the leftovers, the unwanted images that no mortal or god cared to claim. In the hierarchy of divine labor, his role was dull but necessary. In the caverns below the world, near the mouth of Lethe, stood the workshop of sleep. There, the dream messengers called Oneiroi prepared nightly visions. Morpheus crafted the dreams of humans in human form. Folkter handled those filled with beasts and monsters. Phantasos created visions of the inanimate, of stone, water, and shadow. And then there was Oneiros Minor, who handled the rest. He managed the failed dreams, the broken sequences, the half-thoughts of a dozing farmer, the muddled reflections of a priest's late meal, the faint, nonsensical images of a shepherd who had fallen asleep on his crook. His workshop was cluttered. He worked alone. There were shelves of half-formed dreams stored in jars of clouded glass. Each glowed faintly, like a dying ember. Some contained the faces of people who never existed. Some contained places that had never been built. Most contained nothing but fog. His task began when others had finished. At the end of each night, as dawn approached, he swept up the discarded fragments. He examined each one with a tired but careful hand. Some he combined into new shapes, dull and harmless. Others he sent floating upward, to the sleeping minds of children or the very old, where they would dissolve unnoticed. It was said that the dullest dreams are often the safest, that the boring ones protect the mind from madness, and that Oneiros Minor was, in his quiet way, one of the guardians of sanity. Yet no one prayed to him. No one offered him figs or honey at dawn. No poets wrote his name, and because of that, he began to fade. Minor gods in Greek belief could vanish if forgotten. Their existence depended on the small currents of belief, on the faint remembrance in the human mind. So he clung to his routine. He worked with the precision of a craftsman who knows his work will never be praised but must still be done. You can imagine him now, hunched over a table of mist. He holds a small bronze stylus. He scratches runes of sleep into the fabric of a dream. Around him, the workshop hums with the low sigh of sleeping mortals above. It was in one of these forgotten nights that something began to change. A human, a philosopher from Thebes named Istron, began to question his dreams. He noticed that he dreamt of nothing important. No omens, no visitations, no divine messages. Only dull moments of waiting, of walking in circles, of seeing doors that led nowhere. He wrote in his journal that he believed even the gods had grown tired of sending meaning. This thought drifted into the underworld. Belief shapes the gods. And Oneiros Minor, upon hearing the murmur of mortal boredom, began to wonder if he was failing his task. He visited the hall of Hypnos, the god of sleep. It was a hall of soft wind and unmoving air. Statues leaned in repose. Hypnos himself, vast and still, reclined upon a couch of poppy petals. The god barely opened his eyes as Oneiros Minor approached. "You keep the fragments," said Hypnos in a voice like fading breath. "You do what must be done." "But the mortals," said Oneiros Minor, "they find no comfort. They think their dreams have lost meaning." Hypnos smiled faintly. "Meaning is a heavy burden. Not every night needs a message. But if they stop caring," Oneiros Minor whispered, "then I stop existing." There was no answer, only the soft exhale of a world asleep. He returned to his workshop, more restless than before. He began to experiment. He tried weaving dreams with faint echoes of forgotten temples or voices of gods long silent. He sent them into the minds of mortals, hoping someone would notice. A farmer in Corinth dreamt of a clay pot speaking in riddles. A widow in Rhodes dreamt of a river that hummed softly. A child in Delphi dreamt of a small god made of mist asking for his name. The dreams were strange but harmless. They left behind only a feeling of mild curiosity. It was the beginning of something subtle. Oneiros Minor, once forgotten, was quietly returning to mortal thought. But the higher gods noticed. Morpheus and Phantasos spoke among themselves. They found the changes irregular. They whispered that the boundary between dream and wakefulness was thinning. When mortals began to wake confused, unsure if they had dreamed at all, the Council of Sleep called for inquiry. In the quiet of that eternal night, the minor god faced his first judgment. Not in anger, but in disappointment. He had made the dreams too human, too self-aware. The charge was simple. He disturbed the order of sleep. The punishment, yet to be decided, would change the fate of dreams forever. The stars over Nyx's realm flickered faintly, as if unsure whether to stay or fade. And above, on earth, philosophers began to ask why their nights felt shorter, and their mornings emptier. You wonder, if the dull dreams vanished, would sleep ever feel safe again? Would the mind, deprived of its gentle nonsense, survive the long night? The chamber of the sleep court did not have walls. It floated somewhere between the last breath of night and the first flicker of dawn. The air there was soft, weightless, and smelled faintly of crushed poppy petals. It was the only place where time slowed enough for gods to argue without disturbing the mortal world. Oneiros Minor stood alone in the center. Before him, seated on thrones of woven mist, were the higher Oneiroi, Morpheus, Phocter, and Phantasos. Their shadows rippled as though submerged in water. They looked upon him not with cruelty, but with quiet fatigue. "Your dreams have begun to wander," said Morpheus, whose eyes held the reflection of 1,000 sleeping faces. "You have let stray thoughts enter mortal minds. Dreams are meant to soothe, not confuse." Oneiros Minor bowed his head. His bronze stylus hung loosely in his hand. "I meant only to make them notice," he said, "to make them remember that even the dullest dreams come from somewhere." Phantasos spoke next, his voice hollow, echoing like wind through stone. "You gave form to thoughts that should never touch waking minds. A dream is not a message unless sent by design." Phocter, the bringer of nightmares, leaned forward. He was vast and pale, with eyes that shimmered like the bellies of deep-sea fish. "The mortals are stirring in their sleep," he said. "They wake too soon. They see too much." Silence filled the chamber again. The sound of a mortal sigh drifted up from the world below. A child turning in sleep somewhere in Athens. The gods listened to it like judges considering evidence. Then Hypnos appeared. The god of sleep did not walk or rise. He simply emerged, as though the air remembered him. Every god in the chamber lowered their gaze. Hypnos spoke softly. "Dreams are a fragile bridge. They hold the mind between wakefulness and forgetting. Too much meaning and they break. Too little and they vanish." He looked at Oneiros Minor with neither anger nor affection. "You have built crooked bridges," he said. "Explain yourself." Oneiros Minor stepped forward. "I kept the fragments as I was told," he said. "I repaired the broken ones. I filled the empty spaces. But the mortals began to forget even their dull dreams. They stopped finding comfort. They saw the night as blank." Hypnos closed his eyes. "The night has always been blank. It is what protects them. Then why let them dream at all?" The words escaped before Oneiros Minor could stop them. The chamber stirred. Phocter shifted uneasily. Morpheus frowned. For a moment, Hypnos seemed amused. Because without dreams, mortals would remember everything. And no one should remember all that they've seen. The court murmured in agreement. Oneiros Minor's heart sank. He realized he was defending something that none of them valued, the small comfort of nothingness. But then, a strange thing happened. The chamber darkened, and a faint voice drifted through. It was the whisper of a sleeping mortal. "I saw a small god tonight," said the dreamer's voice. "He looked sad. I think he was cleaning my dreams." Every god froze. No mortal had ever described Oneiros Minor before. The dreamer's words carried up like a spark through the mist, shaping reality as they rose. Morpheus leaned forward, frowning. "This is what happens when mortals notice the machinery behind sleep." Phantasos added, they will start to imagine gods into being. The fragile will invent the forgotten. Hypnos's expression remained unreadable. He gestured to the void beside him. From it rose a vast scroll, shimmering with the names of dream gods and their decrees. Your work sustains the balance, he said, but you have stepped beyond it. The mortals are remembering what they should forget. The punishment was decided. You will no longer dwell among the Oneiroi. You will walk the borders of waking and sleep. You will deliver your dull dreams by hand. You will know how fragile belief truly is. Oneiros Minor bowed. He did not plead. He did not curse. He simply asked, and when the mortals stop believing in me altogether? Hypnos gave no answer. Instead, the chamber began to dissolve into the pale blue of approaching dawn. The judgment was complete. That night, across Greece, hundreds of sleepers tossed and turned. Some dreamt of long hallways filled with shelves. Some saw jars glowing with faint light. Others saw a figure with tired eyes sweeping dust into a glass bowl. They would forget him by morning, of course, but not completely. Oneiros Minor walked among them now. He drifted between their beds, silent, unseen. He brushed his fingers across their foreheads and left behind traces of fog. He began to notice something. The mortals who received his dreams slept more deeply, even if they forgot the content. Their faces softened, their breathing steadied. It was as though boredom itself was medicine. He began to believe that his punishment was not a punishment at all. But belief is dangerous in the realm of gods. For when a god begins to believe in his own purpose, he becomes unpredictable. Weeks passed, or centuries, it was impossible to tell in dreamtime. Oneiros Minor wandered from village to village, whispering comfort into the dreams of the sick, the lonely, and the forgotten. He grew weaker but calmer. He became a myth so faint that even poets could not recall his name. And yet, one fragment of him survived. A single mortal, an old midwife from Euboea, woke one morning with a clear memory. She told her grandchildren that a soft voice had told her, "You are allowed to rest." She thought it was an angel or a spirit of night. But she was wrong. It was him, the god no one remembered, the god of dreams too boring to matter. He stood beside her that night as she drifted back to sleep, his faint light flickering like a dying candle. Above them, dawn crept slowly over the sea. In that half-light, he realized something he had never understood. The purpose of dull dreams was not meaning, not order, not divine balance. It was mercy, and somewhere deep in the fog of the underworld, even Hypnos opened one eye, as if remembering what mercy felt like. Still, a question remained, quiet but persistent. If mortals no longer dream of the dull and the meaningless, if every night must hold purpose or prophecy, what happens to rest itself? The centuries moved like clouds. Empires rose, gods fell, and still the quiet ones were forgotten first. The name of Oneiros Minor faded from memory before it was ever spoken aloud. But every night, in the thin space between deep sleep and dawn, something small still moved. A whisper, a flicker, a soft touch across the mind. The dull dream continued its work. You have felt it before. A dream where nothing much happens. You stand in a corridor that never ends. You look for something, though you never remember what. You wake calm, a little confused, but untroubled. That calm came from him. The ancient poets stopped writing about dreams when the oracles fell silent. The temples of Apollo closed. Prophecies lost their audiences. And with them, the great Oneiroi began to lose influence. Morpheus's human dreams became parables no one believed. Folkder's beasts lost their teeth. Phantasos's illusions grew repetitive. But Oneiros Minor's dull work endured, because boredom survives even the collapse of faith. By the time of the Romans, he had no name. He was called Somnus Parvus by a few poets who half-remembered the old myths. They imagined him as a servant who swept up leftover dreams behind Somnus's grand hall. It was not accurate, but it was enough. A whisper of remembrance kept him faintly alive. He walked now among sleeping soldiers, slaves, and senators. He saw the same restless minds as before. Ambition, fear, love, and hunger twisted their sleep. But sometimes, after nights of battle or labor, a man would dream of sitting on a bench beside an empty road, watching nothing. And in that moment, peace returned. That was his gift. Centuries passed. When the Roman lamps burned out and the libraries crumbled, he drifted east. The Persians forgot him. The monks of Byzantium, obsessed with angels and demons, had no room for a god of soft confusion. He became a rumor among scribes who blamed their afternoon drowsiness on invisible spirits. They called it the hour of minor sleep. They were not wrong. He lingered there, among the manuscripts, inside the pauses between copied words. He saw men fall asleep over parchment, their hands still holding pens. He left gentle dreams, never frightening, never grand, always safe, always brief. It was during this era that he met another forgotten god. Her name was Limos, the spirit of gentle hunger. She no longer caused famine, only the mild ache before dinner. They spoke in silence, sitting beside an ancient well. "You kept your duty," she said. "You made boredom into kindness." He smiled faintly. "It is not kindness. It is necessity. The world cannot survive on endless meaning." She nodded. "Nor on endless hunger." They stayed together for a while, two forgotten things sharing quiet company. Neither asked for prayers, neither received them, but the mortal world moved faster. When candles became clocks and clocks became machines, the rhythm of sleep changed. Cities grew louder, dreams shortened. The night, once endless, became an inconvenience. People began to chase the next morning before it arrived. Oneiro's miner struggled to keep up. There were too many minds, too many lights, too little silence. He could no longer reach everyone. The dull dreams scattered thinly, like dust in wind. Somewhere, a scholar in 18th century France recorded a curious thought. "I slept without dreams, and I woke without fear. Perhaps that is divine mercy." It was the last time anyone came close to describing him. By the industrial age, even that thought disappeared. Men worked through the night. Women stitched, typed, and wrote under flickering lamps. The dull dreams had no place to land. He began to fade completely. Still, he tried. He wandered into the dreams of children who napped on trains. He lingered in the sleepless minds of nurses and sailors. He rested beside those who watched the stars through factory smoke. And he whispered the same phrase again and again, hoping someone would hear. "It is enough to rest." No one did. And yet, something strange happened in the modern age. Science began to study dreams, dissecting them like frogs. They found REM cycles, alpha waves, patterns in the brain. But even they admitted something they could not explain. They called it non-REM sleep, the quiet state where no dreams occur, where the mind drifts in blankness, where healing begins. It was him, still there, still working, unseen, unacknowledged, but necessary. The psychologists named it without knowing they had given him new life. The god of unwanted dreams had become the guardian of dreamless sleep. You might think gods die when forgotten, but they do not. They change shape. They hide inside human habits, language, or science. And sometimes they wait inside you. So when you lie awake, restless and overthought, remember him. Remember that your most boring dreams are keeping you whole. That the nonsense of night, the flickering corridors, the empty fields, those are his gifts. Oneiro's miner still walks the borders of waking and rest. He still collects the dreams that no one claims. He still sorts them gently, as he always did, careful not to disturb the quiet. If you listen closely before falling asleep, you might hear it. The faint scrape of a stylus across mist. A god at work, unthanked, unremembered, but necessary. And as you drift, your thoughts slow, the edges blur, and a dull dream begins to form. Nothing happens. Nothing is said. Nothing matters. And that is the point. Because the minor god who managed the dreams nobody wanted is still watching. And tonight, his gift to you is silence. The clay that remembered when Prometheus built early men. Before the gods made humans, the world was very quiet. The rivers ran without names. The wind crossed empty valleys and found nothing to move. Even the birds did not yet sing, for there was no one to hear them. It was during this still age that Prometheus walked the world. He was not like the other titans. They sought power, thrones, and vengeance. He sought improvement. Where they broke, he built. Where they roared, he thought. You can picture him now, walking barefoot through mud at the edge of a forgotten sea. The air is heavy with salt and silence. He bends, studies the clay, and begins to wonder if it could remember. He believed that the earth was alive, that it felt, stored, and recalled. When rain fell, it left traces of sky. When fire passed, it hardened into memory. And so he thought, if clay could remember touch, perhaps it could remember thought too. No one had asked him to make mankind. Zeus was occupied with lightning, Poseidon with storms, Athena with strategy. Prometheus worked alone, half out of curiosity, half out of boredom. He gathered the soft mud of the Perneus River. He mixed it with fine ash from the fires of Mount Othrys. And from that, he shaped the first figures, small, uneven, and hollow. He did not sculpt warriors or kings. He made shapes that resembled the workers he had seen among the gods' servants. Hands open, heads bowed. But as he worked, the clay seemed to pulse faintly. It absorbed his touch. Every fingerprint left a mark that did not fade. He realized then that the clay was storing him. His motion, his warmth, his thought. It remembered him, so he began to shape with more care. He made lines where veins should be. He pressed dimples where skin might fold. He whispered to them as he worked, not knowing why. He told them of stars, of patience, of repetition. When the figures dried, he placed them under the sun. Days passed. They cracked. He repaired them. He waited, but they did not wake. He took them to the mountain and tried to breathe into them, as he had seen Zeus breathe into his storms. Still nothing. He tried water and the figures melted. He tried wind and they toppled. Then one night, as the moonlight reflected on the surface of a still pond, he noticed something. The clay he had discarded, small lumps he had thrown aside, were slowly hardening on their own. When he touched one, he felt warmth. It had absorbed the heat of the day and kept it. He smiled. That night, he gathered the warmest clay and began again. This time he added something new. He mixed in a drop of his own blood. It shimmered faintly, glowing against the mud. And when he breathed upon it again, it stirred. The first human blinked. It looked around as if confused by the concept of around. Touched its own hand. It shivered, not from cold but from awareness. It was alive but fragile. Prometheus did not rejoice. He only observed. He watched the small figure crawl, fall, and stand again. Its eyes reflected his. He realized that creation was not power. It was responsibility. He gave the new being food, figs, roots, water. The man ate clumsily. He made another, this time a woman. Her hands were steady, her eyes calmer. When she looked at the man, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or confusion shared. Days turned into months. Prometheus continued shaping more figures. Some broke in the kiln of sunlight. Some dissolved in the rain. But each one seemed to carry something of the others. A faint familiarity, a memory of movement. It was then that Prometheus noticed something extraordinary. When one of his clay figures fell apart, its dust seemed to whisper. The next figure made from that dust would learn faster, react sooner, breathe more deeply. The clay somehow remembered its past shapes. He realized what he had done. He had made matter that stored experience. The earth itself was learning. When Zeus learned of it, he was unimpressed. He saw no threat in small figures crawling near rivers. But Athena watched closely. She saw in them the flicker of reason, the pattern of imitation. She warned Zeus, "They are small, but they will copy even us." Zeus laughed. "Let them copy. They cannot make thunder." Prometheus smiled quietly. He was not interested in thunder. He was interested in thought. At night, he sat with his new creations. He taught them how to dig, how to bake, how to build shelters. He told them the names of stars. They listened, though they understood little. But they remembered. The next day, they repeated his words to one another. They made new words from them. This was the beginning of language. And Prometheus, seeing how they spoke, began to fear what they might one day say. For memory, once awakened, cannot be undone. And in his hands, clay was no longer just earth. It was history. He watched the first humans gather near a fire he had not lit. They had found embers from lightning and learned to feed it with dry leaves. They warmed their hands, and their faces glowed in the light. They laughed. He had not taught them laughter. That night, he returned to Olympus with a heavy heart. He looked at the gods feasting and wondered if they knew what had begun below. They did not. Not yet. Prometheus understood that his creation would soon outgrow silence. And he began to prepare for what was coming, the age when clay would remember more than its maker. As the first winter settled over Greece, and the rivers turned to mirrors of ice, he stood over the sleeping humans. He touched their foreheads lightly and whispered a single word into their dreams. A word so faint it would echo across millennia. Remember. You wonder now, if the clay itself remembers, then what do you carry from the first man's touch? Is every thought, every warmth, every fear just ancient memory returning to form? When Prometheus first made humans, he believed the hardest part was shaping them. He was wrong. The harder task was keeping them alive. The first winters nearly destroyed them. The new beings huddled in caves, shaking with cold, staring into darkness. Prometheus watched from the hills, helpless. He had given them form, but not warmth. He had built memory, but not endurance. The gods debated whether to intervene. Most were indifferent. Zeus saw the small creatures as experiments that would fade like smoke. Only Athena argued for mercy. "They remember," she said. "That makes them different." But Zeus shook his head. "Memory is not strength. Let them forget, and they will be content." Forgetfulness was, to the gods, a gift. It protected them from remorse, from endless thought. But humans were made from clay that remembered. They could not forget. They recalled every hunger, every cold night, every face that vanished in the snow. They began to fear the dark, not because it killed them, but because it reminded them of what they had lost. Prometheus could not bear it. He wandered the mountains until he found the forge of Hephaestus, god of fire and craft. The forge glowed deep in the volcanic heart of Lemnos. Its light pulsed through the cracks of the earth like a heartbeat. Prometheus stood before it and hesitated. He knew the law: no god could give fire to mortals. It was forbidden not because of danger, but because of pride. Fire belonged to Olympus. It was the symbol of divine control. To share it would blur the boundary between mortal and god. Still, Prometheus reached into the flame. It did not burn him. He hid a spark inside a hollow fennel stalk and carried it down the mountain. The flame flickered, small and trembling, but alive. When he reached the valley, the humans gathered around him in silence. He knelt and placed the stalk before them. They watched wide-eyed as he coaxed the spark onto dry grass. The grass caught. A glow spread across their faces. For the first time, night receded. It was not joy that Prometheus saw in their eyes. It was wonder mixed with recognition. They had seen this light before, in the sun, in lightning, in the forge. But now it was theirs. The fire did not just warm their bodies. It lit the rooms of their minds. They began to think faster, to imagine further. Prometheus stayed with them for a while. He taught them how to keep the flame alive, how to build hearths, how to cook. They learned quickly. The clay remembered. But the fire brought more than comfort. Changed their rhythm. They no longer slept when the sun fell. They sat awake, talking, dreaming, planning. And their dreams grew sharper. They began to dream of what they did not yet have. When the gods saw the glow of countless fires across the earth, they were not angry at first. They were curious. Zeus sent Hermes to investigate. Hermes returned with an uneasy expression. "They build," he said. "They make tools. They hunt better. They remember everything." Zeus frowned. "They remember too much." He summoned Prometheus. The Titan appeared, calm but defiant. Zeus's voice was cold. "You gave them what was not yours to give." Prometheus bowed slightly. "I gave them what they needed. They will use it against us," Zeus said. "They will not," Prometheus replied. "They do not yet understand power." Athena spoke quietly. "But they will." The council fell silent. Zeus turned his gaze to the earth. The fires below flickered like stars fallen from the sky. Each one was a spark of thought, of hunger, of ambition. He could not unsee it. "Then let them burn," Zeus said, "and let him pay for it." Prometheus was seized. Chains of adamantine bound his arms. He was taken to the Caucasus Mountains, where wind never slept. There he was fastened to a rock. Each day, an eagle came to tear at his liver. Each night it grew back. The punishment was endless. From his mountain prison, Prometheus could still see the smoke of human fires rising into the sky. He smiled through his pain. They had survived. The clay remembered him still. But down below, something unexpected was happening. The humans began to change. They built villages. They stored food. They made tools of bronze. They taught their children stories about the Titan who brought them warmth. Generations passed, and the story changed. Prometheus became less a creator, more a thief. The gods became distant. The fire became common. And slowly, humans began to forget the cost of the gift. Yet their dreams did not forget. At night, they still saw mountains, chains, and an eagle. They did not know why. But the memory of the first rebellion lived quietly inside their sleep. Prometheus, from his rock, began to sense it. When mortals dreamed of him, his pain dulled. Their remembering gave him strength. He began to whisper through their dreams, not in words, but in impulses, to build, to question, to resist. This was the real fire, not the flame but the thought. It spread faster than Zeus imagined. It burned in places no lightning could reach. But thought has a cost. The humans who remembered too much began to suffer. They feared death, envied the gods, and longed for eternity. Prometheus had given them not only fire, but consciousness. He had lit the clay. Athena, watching from Olympus, saw this and sighed. "They will never be at peace," she said. Hephaestus replied, "Peace is for things that do not think." Prometheus closed his eyes against the mountain wind. He understood now that creation is never finished. Every improvement carries a shadow, and every spark leaves ashes. He began to wonder if the clay that remembered too well would one day forget mercy. The first humans were already learning to fight over flame. They drew lines in the dirt, claimed ownership of fire pits, and guarded them through the night. Memory became pride. Pride became power, and from power grew punishment. Prometheus could no longer tell if his gift had saved them or doomed them. He asked the wind a question it could not answer. If the clay remembers pain as easily as warmth, will it ever forgive its maker? Prometheus hung from his mountain for what mortals would call eternity. The wind carved lines into his skin. His body healed and broke again each day. The eagle came at dawn without fail, silent at first, then screaming. The pain was the same, always sharp, always expected. It became part of his rhythm, like breathing. But what tormented him most was not the wound. It was the view. From that height he saw everything. The rivers where he once knelt to mold clay. The forests where men first hid from the rain. The distant plains where firelight glowed each night like constellations. He saw them grow. He saw them build. He saw them forget. At first they built simple huts, then villages, then cities that smoked and glittered. Each generation believed itself wiser than the last. Each thought it had discovered fire anew. They no longer told stories of titans or gods. Their fires burned for war, not warmth. Prometheus whispered into the wind, but the wind carried only echoes. Few heard him. Those who did became teachers, healers, thinkers. They spoke of knowledge as a gift. Most of them were ignored or worse, killed for what they knew. He watched, powerless, as the clay he once shaped hardened into pride. Men raised temples not to honor, but to boast. They turned fire into weapon, invention into conquest. Each act of creation birthed another kind of destruction. He wondered if the gods had been right. Maybe forgetfulness had been mercy. One winter night, lightning struck the mountain. The chains cracked, though they did not break. Prometheus turned his head toward the storm and spoke quietly. "Zeus," he said, "look what your silence has made." The thunder answered, not with words, but with laughter that rolled across the peaks. The gods no longer watched the world closely. They had grown tired of it. But the world still remembered them, faintly, through stories, rituals, curses, and awe. That was enough to keep Olympus alive. Faintly, dimly, like an old fire that refused to die. Far below, humans began writing. They carved symbols on tablets, pressed words into wet clay. Prometheus saw it and almost smiled. They were doing to the earth what he had done, making it remember. But he also knew what memory cost. As centuries passed, the clay tablets filled with stories, laws, and prayers. Then came the scrolls, the parchments, the books. The more they remembered, the more they feared forgetting. They built libraries to protect knowledge, as if knowledge could save them from themselves. And when those libraries burned, they rebuilt them again and again. Prometheus's punishment became their pattern. Suffering, learning, rebuilding, always repeating, the cycle of memory. There were moments when he felt their pain as if it were his own. A philosopher questioning the order of the world. A scientist punished for discovery. Poet imprisoned for words. Each one carried a spark of him. Each one bore the cost of curiosity. Then came an age of steel and smoke. The sky darkened not from storms but from human work. Fire was everywhere now, contained, industrial, endless. The air itself shimmered with it. Prometheus could barely tell where the divine flame ended and the human one began. He saw their towers rising higher than mountains. He saw their ships cross seas faster than any god's wind. He saw their lights erase the stars. And he realized something that filled him with quiet awe. The clay had remembered everything. It remembered the warmth of his hands, the breath of his voice, the gift of fire. It remembered rebellion. It remembered curiosity. It remembered pain. The humans no longer prayed to him, but they lived his memory every day. Every spark, every invention, every question asked in defiance was his legacy. He had not given them fire. He had given them himself. The eagle still came. The chains still held. But Prometheus no longer cried out. He watched the horizon instead. Sometimes, through the haze, he could see the faint flicker of city lights. It reminded him of the old campfires. The same flame, only multiplied. He thought of the clay again, the first handful he had touched, the first man who had opened his eyes. He wondered if that man's dust still drifted somewhere in the human bloodstream. If somewhere in every person, a small piece of that original clay still waited, still remembered the warmth of its maker. And perhaps it did. For every time a human built, healed, or forgave, Prometheus felt lighter. Each act of compassion loosened a link in his invisible chain. Each discovery that served life instead of pride dulled the eagle's beak. Maybe, he thought, freedom does not come from breaking chains. Maybe it comes from being remembered the right way. One night, the wind over the mountain carried a strange sound. It was laughter, childlike, soft, human. It rose from the valley far below. A family sat by a small fire, telling stories. One child asked, "Who gave us fire?" The elder smiled and said, "A titan who loved us too much." Prometheus closed his eyes. The eagle did not come that morning. For a brief eternity he slept. When he awoke, the mountain was quiet. No chains, no pain, only wind and light. He looked down at the earth. Forests, rivers, cities, and whispered, "The clay remembered." And somewhere in the noise of civilization, a whisper replied, "We still do." The goddess who counted raindrops for a century. Long before men built temples or named the clouds, there was a goddess whose only duty was to count. Her name was Umbra. She did not rule storms, nor command thunder. She did not ride the winds or speak in lightning. Her task was quieter. She counted every drop of rain that fell upon the earth. The Greeks never built her a shrine. No hymns were sung for her patience. But the priests of Thessaly spoke of her in whispers. They said she walked across valleys during long rains, her bare feet sinking in mud, her lips moving silently, keeping count. It is said that when Zeus released storms from his vault, he never looked twice at them. He cared only for the display, the roar, the flash, the fear. But Umbra cared for what came after. The small, invisible rhythm of each drop striking soil. She had once been a servant of Poseidon, measuring tides for his records. But she found the sea too loud, too proud. When the rain fell, she heard something the ocean never offered: variation. Every drop was unique in weight, speed, and sound. Each one a single note in the music of the world. She began counting them as an act of devotion. First it was curiosity, then habit, then necessity. The gods laughed at her. Even Hermes, kind as he was, teased her. "You could count stars," he said. "Why choose something that vanishes the moment it falls?" Umbra smiled faintly. "Because it vanishes. That's what makes it worth remembering." She believed that if every drop was noticed, none of the world would truly be forgotten. Her count was not for glory but for balance. Each drop she named, the earth remembered a little better how to grow, how to heal. Her records were strange. Not scrolls or tablets, but lines drawn in sand and air. She marked time by puddles, by reflections, by the changing rhythm of dripping leaves. To her, rain was the true calendar of the earth. 1 century, Zeus commanded endless drought as punishment for mortal pride. The rivers shrank, the fields cracked, and the people of Arcadia prayed for a single storm. Umbra, bound by duty, stood upon the dry plains, unable to count. For the first time in her immortal life, there was nothing to measure. She felt hollow. Her hands, made to move with rhythm, now hung idle. The silence was heavier than thunder. She walked the parched valleys, tracing patterns in the dust, whispering to the sky. "Where have you gone?" she asked the clouds that would not form. No answer came. The other gods ignored her grief. Ares celebrated the drought, for wars multiplied in hunger. Apollo wrote hymns about endurance. Even Demeter turned her eyes away, powerless to make the earth fertile without water. Umbra alone mourned for the sound of falling rain. In her solitude, she began to hear something else. Beneath the soil, faint and slow, the sound of sleeping seeds. They were alive but still, waiting, counting in their own way the moments until her return. She knelt and pressed her ear to the ground. It was warm, pulsed faintly, like a slow heartbeat. The earth, too, was keeping time. She realized then that her counting had never been one-sided. The rain remembered her as she remembered it. Every drop she had ever counted had soaked into soil that now whispered her name in silence. So she began to count the waiting instead. She counted seconds of drought, grains of dust, cracks in the riverbed. Each was a promise of rain yet to come. 100 years passed. Mountains eroded. Empires rose and fell. The mortals forgot her name, but Ambra did not forget them. She kept counting. Then, one night, a breeze shifted over the Aegean. The sky thickened. Thunder rolled like an old drum remembering its rhythm. And the first drop fell. Ambra raised her hand and caught it. It was warm, heavy, and full of dust. She whispered, "1." The sky broke open. Rain fell in sheets. She began to count again, her voice rising in time with the storm. It was a song of gratitude, but also warning. For in her century of silence, she had learned something new, that too much remembering can drown the world as easily as forgetting can dry it. As the storm poured across Greece, washing away temples and homes alike, Ambra walked through the flood, still counting, still whispering. She did not try to stop it. The world needed to remember the rain again, even if it hurt. By dawn, the rivers overflowed. The fields were alive again, and in the quiet after the storm, the mortals awoke to puddles filled with reflections of their own faces. They did not know her name, but they felt her presence. Somewhere inside them, something counted along with the falling drops. Ambra smiled, exhausted. She had done her duty, but she also knew that the rain had changed her. She had begun to wonder what it meant to count forever in a world that forgets so easily. Could memory itself become a burden? Could devotion, repeated endlessly, turn into chains? When the great storm ended, the world sighed. The rivers glistened, the mountains steamed, and the air smelled of renewal. Mortals rejoiced. The priests thanked Zeus, though it was not his mercy that brought the rain. Only Ambra knew how much it had cost. She sat by a flooded plain in silence. Her count had reached a number beyond speech. Her voice was raw. Every drop she had named echoed in her head, overlapping, endless. She had given each a name, and now the names would not stop repeating. Memory, she realized, was heavier than water. Days passed. The storm drained into rivers, then the sea. Ambra still counted the puddles, the drips from leaves, the last beads clinging to grass. Even when the world dried, she kept counting the absences where rain had been. The other gods began to whisper that she had gone mad. But Athena disagreed. "She has not lost her mind," she said. "She has drowned in it." For centuries, Ambra's task had been balance. Now it had become obsession. The rain no longer spoke to her, simply fell indifferent. And she, who had once brought order to its chaos, found herself trapped in its echo. She began to wander across the world, following storms. She climbed mountains to count mist, waited at river mouths for drizzle, even knelt by fountains to track their spray. Her skin, once luminous, became pale and cracked. Mortals who saw her thought she was a ghost of the weather. They left offerings, cups of water, flowers, and salt, to calm her sorrow. One child in Lesbos claimed to have spoken with her. He said she whispered, "Every drop I name becomes memory. Every memory becomes weight. Tell your people to forget sometimes." But mortals did not listen. They built aqueducts, canals, and wells. They stored water, measured rainfall, kept records. They became her reflection, builders of memory, prisoners of detail. She had made them in her image without meaning to. Ambra watched this unfold with quiet horror. They now worshipped the pattern, not the purpose. Her counting had infected the world. She climbed Mount Othries seeking counsel from the old Titan Mnemosyne, goddess of memory itself. The climb took years or moments, it was hard to tell in divine time. At the summit, she found the Titan seated in mist, her face veiled, her eyes unreadable. "Why do you suffer?" Mnemosyne asked. "I remember too much," said Ambra. "I cannot stop. Even the silence speaks to me." Mnemosyne smiled faintly. "You mistake remembering for wisdom. True memory is not keeping everything. It is knowing what to release." Ambra frowned. "Then what should I forget?" "Forget yourself," said Mnemosyne. "Forget the counter. Let the rain fall without you. It will still fall." The words struck her like thunder. For centuries she had believed that the rain needed her, that without her counting it would lose meaning. Now she began to suspect the opposite, that her counting had trapped it. She descended the mountain, her thoughts heavy but clear. She decided to stop counting. She walked into a storm and opened her arms, letting the rain fall freely. At first, she trembled with instinct. The drops landed on her skin, unmeasured, unnamed. Her lips twitched to speak numbers, but she held still. The silence that followed was terrifying and beautiful. The storm lasted 3 days. When it ended, she felt lighter. For the first time in a century, she slept. In her dreams, she saw the rain as it truly was. Not chaos, not order, but rhythm. It did not need her voice. It only needed to fall. But dreams are fragile even for gods. When she woke, the world had changed. The mortals had not stopped counting. They now measured everything: time, stars, floods, even heartbeats. They had inherited her habit. She had passed on her burden without meaning to. She tried to warn them. She appeared to a priest of Delphi in a dream and whispered, "If you measure everything, you will lose wonder." He woke and recorded the words. Then he began to measure his dreams. Umbra wept. She realized that forgetting was not a skill mortals would ever master. They had taken her obsession and turned it into civilization. Their calendars, clocks, and ledgers were her new temples. One night, she stood by a river swollen with recent rain. The water glowed with moonlight. She touched the surface, and the ripples moved outward, slow and even. She counted them. Old habits die hardest in silence. She whispered, "How do I end what I began?" The river answered only in reflection, her face broken into pieces by motion. Perhaps that was the answer. Nothing ends, it only changes form. Even memory. As dawn came, she looked at the sky and realized she was disappearing. Her edges blurred, her body turning translucent, her voice faint. The world no longer needed her to count. It had learned how to do it alone. Her last thought before fading was not sorrow but peace. She had become what she loved, part of the rain, everywhere, unnoticed. Yet some say she left a final gift. Every time a storm begins after long drought, the first drop always falls slower than the rest. That pause, that hesitation is her breath. A brief reminder that, before the flood, someone once cared enough to count. Still, one question remained, unanswered as the centuries rolled on. If the rain remembers its counter, does the counter ever truly disappear? It rained for 7 nights across the Peloponnesian coast. Farmers woke to overflowing fields. Fishermen cursed the swollen rivers that swallowed their boats. Children pressed faces against windows to watch the endless gray. They thought it was only weather. They did not know it was remembrance. Each drop that fell carried a whisper of Umbra. She had dissolved into the rain but not vanished. She had become part of the cycle she once measured. She fell as dew on the same earth she used to count from afar. She soaked into roots and flowed through rivers. The goddess who had spent a century naming every drop was now nameless herself, moving freely at last. The gods above noticed the balance she left behind. Zeus called it efficient. Poseidon called it boring. Only Athena saw it for what it was: elegant. The storm had learned to govern itself. The world no longer needed divine supervision to maintain rhythm. Umbra had taught the sky to remember without her. That was her greatest success, and her quiet undoing. As years passed, her name became myth, then silence. The rain continued, steady, uncounted, but mortals began to feel something strange during storms, a calm sadness. They would sit under roofs, listening, and feel the weight of something ancient yet kind. They called it the rain's patience. In truth, it was her. The philosophers of the early Aegean spoke of rhythm as the secret law of life. They believed the body, the tides, and the seasons all moved in patterns too subtle for reason. They called this harmony Ombros, after the old word for rain. They never knew they were naming her again. In the centuries that followed, scribes recorded her as a nameless spirit of timing. Farmers prayed for the right moment to plant, sailors for the right wind to sail, lovers for the right silence between words. They were all unknowingly speaking to her ghost. Even without form, Umbra observed. She flowed through the rivers that mortals redirected into canals and fountains. She touched the metal pipes of Rome, the aqueducts of Spain, the wells of Persia. She had become the infrastructure of memory. Every time mortals measured rainfall, they honored her without knowing. But one night, deep in winter, She drifted above a barren land in Anatolia. There was no sound, no color, only frozen silence. Snow fell, not rain. She tried to count, but snow did not sound like rain. It muted everything. For the first time since her dissolution, she felt lonely. She realized that even the world that remembered her could not remember her perfectly. Memory changes, loses detail, forgets tone. Even the rain, once her language, had begun to evolve without her rhythm. The drops fell faster now, impatient, shaped by shifting winds and cities that scraped the sky. She felt herself thinning again. Divinity fades not from death but from irrelevance. The mortals had mastered measurement. They built devices to count what she once named by instinct. The barometer replaced her ears, the gauge replaced her eyes. The goddess of patience was outpaced by precision. And yet she could not hate them. Their obsession with accuracy was her legacy. She had taught them to notice, to watch the ordinary until it revealed pattern. They had taken her purpose and turned it into science. So Amber chose to rest. She sank deep into a forest untouched by axes or cities, where the rain still fell without number. There, she slept beneath moss and leaves, her spirit mingling with roots and groundwater. The rhythm of drops against branches was slow and even. Time blurred. Centuries later, travelers passing through that forest described an odd phenomenon. During storms, the rain there never made sound. It fell in complete silence, as if the air itself held its breath. The locals called it Amber's Grove. They said if you walked there during rainfall, you could feel peace so complete that you would forget your own name for a moment. That forgetting was her final blessing. It was the release Mnemosyne had once told her to seek, the mercy of not needing to hold everything. Ambra had finally learned that forgetting was not the enemy of memory, but its balance. Even now, when it rains softly against your window and you lose track of time, you feel her presence. Not as a goddess or spirit, but as a pause. That tiny moment between one drop and the next when you stop counting. That silence is her gift. The gift of a goddess who spent a century counting raindrops so the world could learn how to stop. The next time you hear rain, listen for her rhythm. The rhythm that once kept the world alive. And if you can, let it fall without number. Because somewhere in that infinite pattern, she is still counting, still teaching, still reminding the world that even water remembers its listener. The lost village of satyrs who forgot how to dance. In the old hills of Arcadia, where oaks leaned close to one another like gossiping elders, there once stood a village that no map remembered. It was said to be the home of the last satyrs, the goat-legged, wine-drunk companions of Dionysus who once filled Greece with laughter and music. But this village was different. Its satyrs had forgotten how to dance. You would not have known they were divine by looking at them. Their horns were dulled, their hooves chipped, their eyes tired. They lived among overgrown vines and crumbling altars, tending sheep in silence. The sound of pipes and laughter, once their nature, had vanished. No travelers came anymore. Even the wind passed through without song. The mortals of nearby towns called it Thermus, the cold grove. They avoided it. They said strange things happened there. Wine soured, firewood refused to catch flame, and echoes returned too slowly, as if the air was thinking. No one knew why the satyrs had stopped dancing, but the oldest among them remembered. His name was Lycon, once a companion of Dionysus himself. He had led processions through the mountains, his pipe calling mortals from their homes to join the wild feasts of the god of joy. But those days were gone. Dionysus had left long ago. His cult had spread, diluted, turned to ritual instead of ecstasy. Temples replaced groves. Priests replaced revelers. Wine became offering instead of celebration. And when joy was turned into duty, the satyrs began to fade. At first, they forgot melodies, then rhythm, then motion itself. One morning, they simply stood still and never started again. Lycon still kept his old pipes on a shelf inside his hut. He dusted them every day but never played. He said the reeds no longer responded. "They miss his breath," he would murmur, meaning Dionysus. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the ridge, a stranger arrived. A young mortal woman, soaked from rain, carrying a broken lyre. She introduced herself as Melody. She was a wandering musician who had lost her audience. Villages no longer welcomed songs, she said. They preferred silence now or sermons. When she asked for shelter, Lycon let her in. She looked around the hut and noticed the dusty pipes. "Whose are those?" she asked. "Mine," he said. "Do they still play?" "No," he said. Not since the god left. She frowned. Then perhaps it's not the god that left, but the music. Her words unsettled him. No mortal had spoken like that in centuries. That night, while she slept, Lycon sat outside, staring at the moonlit vines. He remembered the nights when they would sway in rhythm with the satyr's songs, when the air itself seemed drunk with movement. He tried to hum one of the old tunes, but no sound came. Even memory resisted melody. The next morning, Melody wandered through the grove, touching bark, listening to the ground. When she returned, she said quietly, "The earth hums here. You've just stopped hearing it." Lycon sighed. "We have grown old." "Then listen like the young," she said. He did not answer, but her words clung to him. For days, she repaired her lyre with twine and resin. Each night, she played a single note and waited for it to echo. At first, the sound vanished into the trees. Then, faintly, an echo began to return. Not from the mountains, but from the air around them. It was thin, hesitant, but real. The other satyrs gathered in confusion. They watched her with mild curiosity, as if remembering something forgotten. Their hooves shifted on the ground. Their ears twitched. When she struck another note, one of them tapped a hoof in time. Startled him. Lycon said nothing, but his hands trembled. He went to his hut, opened the old wooden box, and took out his pipes. He placed them to his lips. First, only dust came out. Then, after a long breath, a sound emerged. A weak, uneven tone that cracked like dry wood. Still, it was music. The others froze. Some looked frightened, others curious. Melody smiled softly. "That's enough," she said. "That's how you begin." The sound spread through the grove, faint but persistent. Even the birds stirred. Leaves rustled where there had been stillness. The air seemed to remember rhythm. That night, for the first time in a century, the satyrs gathered by the old altar. They poured wine, though it had turned sour. They danced, though they stumbled. They sang, though their voices cracked. It was not joy yet, but it was motion. And in motion lies memory. High above, on Mount Parnassus, Dionysus stirred in his sleep. The sound reached him faintly, like an echo of his own laughter long ago. He smiled, half dreaming. "Ah," he whispered, "they are learning again." Back in the grove, the fire flickered. The satyrs moved clumsily, awkwardly, but the rhythm was coming back, and Lycon, pipe in hand, closed his eyes. He did not notice that Melody had stopped playing. She only watched, silent, as if her purpose was complete. By dawn, the music faded. The satyrs slept where they stood. When they woke, Melody was gone. Only her lyre remained, hanging from a branch, still vibrating faintly in the wind. Lycon touched it and felt warmth. He realized the strings were wet, not with dew, but with tears. His own or the gods', he could not tell. He looked around at the others and said quietly, "We remembered," but deep inside he feared what forgetting again might cost them. The silence of the grove had lifted for now, but silence, once learned, is hard to unlearn. The next morning, fog covered the grove like a heavy blanket. The satyrs stirred, uneasy, their hooves damp with dew. The smell of wet earth reminded them of the old feasts, of wine and thunder and song. But the memory felt like someone else's life, faint and blurred. Lycon stood by the altar, staring at Melody's lyre hanging from the branch. It still vibrated faintly when the wind passed through. He reached out, touched the strings, and heard a single trembling note. It echoed longer than it should have. Something in the grove was listening. He turned to the others. "Play," he said. They hesitated. No one moved. One satyr, small and young, whispered, "We do not remember how." "Then remember with your feet," Lycon replied. "The ground will remind you." The young one stepped forward, tapped his hoof against the dirt. Then again, a little faster. A rhythm began, uncertain but alive. Another joined, then another. The sound grew into a low, steady pulse, like the heartbeat of the earth. Lycon lifted his pipes and played. The tone came easier this time, the air warmer. For the first time in generations, the grove had a rhythm. The satyrs swayed clumsily at first. Their bodies creaked, their movements awkward. But the longer they moved, the more natural it became. The fog began to thin, rising into slow spirals that looked almost like smoke. Lycon closed his eyes and played a melody he did not know he remembered. It was not one of the wild songs of Dionysus, but something older, gentle, circular, without climax or end. It was the rhythm of the seasons, of rain on leaves, of breathing. It was the kind of music that never demanded applause, only attention. As he played, he saw the grove change. The dead vines lifted slightly. Moss shimmered on the rocks. Even the trees leaned in. The air carried warmth, faint but unmistakable. Life was listening. When the music stopped, the satyrs fell silent. None spoke. They were breathing hard, eyes wide, hearts pounding. For a long moment, they just stood in the mist, hearing the echo fade. Then one laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, like a hiccup. Then another joined. Soon the grove was full of laughter. Not wild or drunken, but real. The kind that comes after remembering what it feels like to be alive. That night, the fire burned bright again. The satyrs drank water that tasted like wine and danced until their legs ached. They were not perfect, but perfection had never been the goal. Movement was enough, and as they danced, something stirred beyond the grove. In the distance, the vines began to move on their own. Fruit that had long since shriveled began to swell. A faint hum rose from the earth, slow and constant. It spread outward, beyond the trees, beyond Arcadia. Somewhere far away, a temple priest paused mid-prayer. He thought he heard music in the wind, but dismissed it. Mortals no longer recognized divine rhythm when they heard it. But the world did. The rhythm reached rivers, rocks, and roots. It was not music for ears. It was for the ground itself. In Olympus, Dionysus finally woke. He had been dreaming of his old processions, of wild laughter and spinning torches. When he opened his eyes, he smelled earth and wine. He smiled faintly. "They've begun again," he said. He stood, stretching, and looked down at Arcadia. He saw the faint glow of fire in the grove. He heard the rhythm through the soil, pulsing up through the mountains. He had missed that sound more than he realized. But he did not descend. He knew that divine visits often ruin mortal miracles. If he appeared, they would stop dancing to look at him. Better they dance without knowing. Instead, he whispered a single word into the wind. "Remember." The wind carried it down, soft as breath. Lycon felt it brush his ear mid-song. He froze for a moment, recognizing the voice. Then he played louder. The grove answered. Every leaf moved in time. Every creature, bird, mouse, beetle, found rhythm in its motion. Even silence joined, holding the spaces between notes like invisible percussion. The satyrs danced until dawn. When the sun rose, it found them collapsed, smiling, asleep in the grass. The fire had burned out, but the warmth remained. The grove was no longer called Thermos. It was alive again. Yet, as all miracles do, this one carried a question. How long could memory survive without practice? Would they still dance when she, the mortal musician, never returned? Lycon woke before the others. He looked at the lyre hanging from the branch. Its strings were still vibrating in the morning breeze. He whispered to it, "You taught us to remember. Who will teach us not to forget?" The lyre gave no answer, only a soft hum that faded into silence. The god's word, "remember," still hung in the air, but Lycon wondered if remembrance was enough. For joy, once forgotten, must be relearned every day. The grove lived again, but not as before. The laughter was softer now, the music slower. The satyrs had grown older than they should have been, and even joy carried the quiet weight of memory. But still, each morning, they gathered to practice rhythm. They played until the sun was high, then rested in shade, always afraid of silence. Lycon became their teacher. He tuned the pipes every dawn, though the reeds cracked easily now. He taught them how to breathe, how to move in circles, how to let the sound travel through their bodies instead of through skill. He said often, "You do not make music, you return it." The others listened, though they did not always understand. But something in his tone kept them humble. The grove began to change again. Flowers grew thicker, fruit ripened faster. Rain fell gently every evening, as if the sky itself kept time with their rhythm. Even the birds nested lower, closer to the ground, where the music was strongest. Travelers began to pass through. They spoke of strange melodies that seemed to come from nowhere. Some stayed for a night and awoke with lighter hearts. Others ran, unsettled by the feeling of being watched by trees. No one ever saw Lycon clearly. To them, he was only a rumor, a spirit of sound that haunted Arcadia. But time, even for forgotten gods, moves quietly forward, and memory, left untended, begins to blur. Years passed. The younger satyrs grew restless. They began to wonder if they still needed the old ways. They played louder, faster, less carefully. The music became showy. The rhythm lost patience. One night, as the moon rose, they decided to dance without Lycaon's lead. They played their pipes together, wild and proud. The grove shook. The vines twisted. The fire roared too high. Something deep beneath the roots stirred in protest. Lycaon woke to the sound of chaos. He rushed from his hut, the old pipes in hand. The air was thick with heat and noise. The satyrs danced like storms, uncontrolled. He shouted for them to stop, but they couldn't hear him over the sound of their own joy. He saw in their faces the same hunger he once saw in mortals during the festivals of Dionysus. Joy turned into excess. The line between celebration and destruction had blurred again. He climbed onto a rock and blew into his pipes with all the strength left in him. The first note cut through the air like a command. The second steadied the rhythm. The third slowed it. The fourth silenced everything. The grove froze. The satyrs stopped mid-step. The fire dimmed to a glow. Even the wind seemed to kneel. Lycaon lowered the pipes. He looked at them, tired but calm. "This is not how we remember," he said. "This is how we forget." No one spoke. The young ones bowed their heads. He looked around the grove at the faces, the trees, the stones. He knew the rhythm would not survive much longer. Joy, once forced, cannot stay pure. He turned his gaze to the sky. It was cloudless, clear, indifferent. He smiled. "Then let this be enough," he whispered. He began to play again, not the wild music of youth, nor the gentle rhythms of memory, but something in between. It was steady, calm, final. Each note was a farewell. Each breath carried a fragment of the old god's laughter. The satyrs listened, still and reverent. When the last note faded, the grove fell silent. Lycaon stood motionless, the pipes still in his hands. Then, slowly, he turned to stone. The moss grew over him within days. The satyrs did not touch him. They built a circle of stones around where he stood and left the pipes there, untouched. Over time, the grove began to fade again. The music stopped. The vines thickened. The paths disappeared, and silence returned. But it was a different silence now, not emptiness, but peace. Centuries later, shepherds wandering through Arcadia found the clearing. They saw the circle of stones and a shape half buried in moss. They said the statue looked like a man smiling, holding a flute. When rain fell, the drops struck the old stone pipes and made faint tones. No one could explain it, but travelers who slept nearby claimed they dreamed of laughter, of dancing hooves, of soft music in the wind. The villagers began calling it the Grove of the Last Song. They did not know who the figure was or what he played, but they left offerings, wine, fruit, and garlands. And sometimes, on still nights, they swore the air hummed in rhythm, like the world itself was quietly keeping time. Maybe it was Lycaon, maybe it was the grove, or maybe it was the echo of joy refusing to die completely, because even forgotten gods leave vibrations in the earth. And when you walk through the ruins of old places and feel the strange urge to hum, you are answering that rhythm. The one that began in a grove where silence once ruled. That rhythm will never be written down, and that is how it stays alive. The oracle's assistant who filed prophecies by hand. In Delphi, where the air always smelled faintly of laurel and smoke, there was once a man named Ion. He was not a prophet. He did not speak for Apollo. He did not hear the divine voice that filled the temple chambers when the oracle spoke. He only wrote. His job was simple and endless. When the oracle inhaled the sacred vapors and uttered her cryptic verses, Ion wrote them down. Every word, every pause, every repetition. His task was to file the future. The oracle was famous across Greece. Kings sent gold. Generals sent armies. Farmers sent doves. Everyone came to ask. No one came to remember. That was Ion's work. Each morning, he swept the temple floor, replaced the reed pens, and prepared the scrolls. By noon, the air would fill with pilgrims, their voices echoing under the marble arch. At the back of the hall, the oracle sat upon her tripod, steam rising around her like a slow fire. When the god entered her body, she spoke in fragments, sometimes clear, sometimes nonsense. Ion's hand never stopped moving. He did not interpret. He did not question. He recorded, dated, and filed. In rows of clay jars behind the main chamber, he kept thousands of scrolls, prophecies no one would ever read twice. He was the only one who noticed how the words changed over time. In the early years, the oracle spoke in thunder. Cities will rise and fall. Kings will burn. Seas will boil. Later, her voice softened. Wait until the wind changes. The seed will know when to grow. By Ion's 10th year, the prophecies had grown strangely quiet. They no longer warned or promised. They only described. He told the high priest. The priest waved him away. "The God speaks as he wishes," he said. Ion nodded, but he kept thinking. He began to read through the old scrolls at night by lamplight. He saw a pattern, words repeating through decades. Wait, turn, repeat, remember. The oracle had begun to predict not the future, but the act of prophecy itself. The god, it seemed, was running out of things to say. Ion kept writing. He could not stop. The habit had become a kind of worship. Each syllable felt like an offering, each word a bead on an endless string. His fingertips grew stained with ink. His eyes learned to move faster than thought. But one afternoon, something changed. The oracle entered her trance and said nothing. Her mouth opened. Her breath shook. But no words came. The crowd murmured. The high priest panicked. Ion froze, reed poised above the scroll. He waited for sound. After several long moments, she whispered one word, silence. Then she collapsed. When she woke, she remembered nothing. Ion wrote the word carefully. He dated it. He placed it in the jar with the others. But that single word would not leave him. The next day, the oracle spoke again, but her voice was weaker, her sentences shorter. The god's presence seemed thinner, almost human. Ion wrote faster, as if afraid the language itself might escape. Weeks passed. The pilgrims noticed. They whispered that Apollo's favor was fading. Offerings stopped coming. The temple grew quiet. Ion still wrote even when there were no visitors. He began to record the silence between words, the pauses, the sighs, the sound of her breathing. He gave each silence a line, each hesitation a mark. He filled scrolls with nothing but space. He labeled them unspoken prophecies. The high priest found him one night surrounded by stacks of blank parchment. "What are these?" he demanded. "Answers," Ion said. "The ones we never heard." The priest shook his head. "The god speaks through voice, not absence." Ion smiled faintly. "Then perhaps the god has gone quiet, and we have not noticed." The next morning he was dismissed. They replaced him with a younger scribe who wrote faster, but with less care. Ion gathered his scrolls, both written and blank, and left Delphi. He walked down the mountain into the mist, carrying silence as his final record. The temple continued without him. The new scribes filled the jars with new words. But over the years, something odd began to happen. When they opened old scrolls to consult prophecies, the ink had faded from many of them, especially the ones Ion had written. The letters were gone, but the parchment was still warm to the touch. Priests said it was humidity. Others said it was divine interference. Only the oldest among them suspected the truth, that the words had returned to their source. Ion wandered from town to town, writing still. Not prophecy, not poetry, just observations. He wrote how many steps a farmer took to the well, how long a candle burned before dying, how many breaths it took for a child to fall asleep. Each note went into a jar. He kept them in a shed by the river. When he died, no one claimed them. Centuries later, when the Temple of Delphi was abandoned, archaeologists found Ion's scrolls stored apart from the others. Most were empty. but when handled, they gave off a faint smell of ink and smoke, as if words had only recently left them. On one parchment, barely visible, was a single sentence scratched into the corner. The god did not stop speaking. We stopped listening. The scholars could not date it precisely. They filed it under undeciphered fragment, 3rd century BCE. But the archivist who handled it swore that the parchment pulsed faintly in his hand, like a slow heartbeat. He placed it in a sealed case, and sometimes, when he walked by at night, he thought he heard scratching inside, as if a reed pen was still writing. Years after Ion's disappearance, Delphi began to decay in silence. The marble steps cracked, the golden offerings dulled, and the oracle's voice, once a torrent, became a thin trickle of sound, soft as a dying ember. The priests called it divine restraint. The philosophers called it fatigue. The farmers called it bad luck. But none of them noticed the real reason. There were too many words already. The future had become crowded. Every prophecy Ion had written still existed in the temple's jars. Thousands of scrolls stacked to the ceiling. Each one claimed a destiny, a warning, or a promise. But time is narrow, and the world could not hold them all. The scribes began to notice contradictions. One scroll said a king would die by poison. Another said by blade. Both bore the same date. Both sealed by the same hand, Ion's. They tried to decide which was true. Neither was. Both were possibilities. The more they read, the more tangled it became. The prophecies began to echo one another, like mirrors facing mirrors. Some even began to repeat themselves exactly, down to the misplaced comma, as if written twice by accident. Except the handwriting was slightly different, more hurried, more uncertain. A priest named Phocas was assigned to organize the archive. He believed in precision. He separated scrolls by tone, subject, and mood. Warnings in one row, blessings in another, the undecipherable ones, the blank ones, the strange silent scrolls that Ion had written, he burned. That night, a storm broke over the mountains. The rain fell hard enough to rattle the clay jars. The scribes swore they heard whispering from the archive, the sound of reeds scratching, of paper fluttering in a room with no wind. By morning, all the new scrolls were blank. Phocas panicked. He thought the ink had washed away, but the jars were dry. The words themselves were gone. He opened one and held the parchment to his ear. He thought he heard something faint. A voice speaking from inside, patient and slow, repeating the word again. He ordered the jars sealed. No one spoke of it, but rumors spread across Delphi. The oracle refused to prophesy for 3 months. When she finally spoke, her message was simple. The words are tired. That frightened the priests more than any curse. How could words tire? How could prophecy sleep? Yet Ion had known this would happen. In a small village downriver, the villagers found his shed years later after a flood. Inside, hundreds of his jars lay buried in mud. When opened, each contained a single parchment with no words, only faint indentations, as if written and erased again and again. But when light hit the surface just right, you could see the marks forming the same symbols, repeated endlessly. Circles, spirals, loops. Ion had not been writing language. He had been recording patterns. A local scholar named Irenaeus collected the jars. He spent years studying them. He noticed that the marks on one parchment matched the grain rings of nearby trees. Another mirrored the shape of ripples in the river. Another, the paths of stars reflected in water. Ion had been mapping repetition the way the world speaks without words. It was not prophecy. It was record. He had turned the act of writing into listening. Irenaeus took one jar to Delphi to show the priests. They dismissed him. Prophecy comes from the god, they said. not from mud and pattern. He left the jar by the altar and returned home. That night, lightning struck the temple roof. No one was hurt, but the archive burned. Thousands of years of prophecy turned to smoke. Only the jar Irenaeus left survived. When the priests opened it after the fire, they found no scroll inside, only dust and a single reed pen. The pen was still wet with ink. They stored it in the treasury and called it the silent instrument. No one used it again, but it was said that when the wind blew through the temple, the pen rolled slightly as if still working. Generations passed. The new oracle spoke again, but never like before. Their words grew simpler, closer to truth, or perhaps to nothing. Farmers asked when to plant. The oracle answered, "When the soil tells you." Sailors asked when to sail. She said, "When the wind insists." It was as if Apollo had abandoned grammar altogether. One young priest, curious, returned to Ion's shed decades later. The river had long since moved, leaving the ruins buried in reeds. Inside, he found one jar unbroken. He opened it carefully. Inside was a piece of parchment with 6 faint words written in Ion's hand. "The future is what remembers itself." The priest could not understand it. He brought it back to the temple and read it aloud. The oracle, hearing it, smiled faintly. "That was his last prophecy," she said, "and the truest." After that day, the oracle no longer used the sacred vapors. She no longer waited for Apollo's voice. She sat in silence, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, and when she finally spoke, her words were few. Not predictions, but reminders. Simple ones. Rest. Wait. Listen. Delphi never regained its glory. But for a while, travelers came again, not to learn the future, but to learn patience. And on quiet afternoons, when the wind passed through the columns, it carried the faint scratching of a reed pen. Ion was still there, somewhere in the silence, writing down what words could not hold. You wonder, if the gods spoke less and men listened more, would prophecy even be needed? Would the future unfold on its own, steady and wordless, like a hand moving across paper no one is watching? Centuries passed after the temple fell quiet. The gods faded into memory. The stones of Delphi cracked under vines, and the mountain wind carried no prayers. But deep beneath the ruins, in a small side chamber no one had entered for generations, something remained. A shelf, a single clay jar, and inside it Ion's last record. It was not written on parchment. It was etched into a thin sheet of bronze, so worn that even time had trouble erasing it. The markings were faint, circular, repeating half letters, half patterns. No one alive could read them, but the metal still hummed faintly when touched, as if remembering the rhythm of his hand. Ion's bronze record told no prophecy. It did not name kings, wars, or futures. Contained a method. Lines and arrows showed how to listen. He had written instructions not for divination, but for attention. Observe the pattern. Wait for the echo. Write only what stays. The scholars who later found it dismissed it as nonsense. They called it a scribe's meditation. But one of them, a quiet woman named Euphemia, kept studying it. She realized the marks matched the rhythm of rainfall in Delphi's valley. Each circle marked a pause where rain slowed, each dash a new cloudburst. Ion had written the pattern of a storm. He had turned prophecy into weather. Euphemia began tracing his markings against the modern sky. She stood in the ruins, listening to the wind through broken marble. She wrote what she heard, not words, just symbols. When she compared her notes to Ion's, the lines matched. Storm and silence, separated by centuries, spoke in the same rhythm. Frightened her, not because it was divine, but because it was exact. Nothing had changed. The world had repeated itself. She published her findings, but no one cared. The world no longer believed in patterns that could not be measured by machines. Delphi became a tourist site. People came to take pictures, not to listen. The place where words once shaped destinies now sold postcards. But some nights, after the crowds left, Euphemia stayed. She sat on the cracked stones where the oracle once spoke and laid Ion's bronze plate on her lap. She whispered to it, "What did you hear that we cannot?" No answer came, only the wind. But she noticed something. The bronze vibrated when she spoke certain words. Wait, listen, silence. It stayed still when she spoke names, dates, or numbers. Ion's record only responded to patience. She began to think that perhaps the oracle had not failed at all. Maybe prophecy had evolved past language. Maybe the god had not gone silent, only slower. She left Delphi soon after, taking the bronze plate with her. It was never seen again, but rumors persisted. Monks in later centuries spoke of a woman who carried a metal tablet that sang softly during storms. Some said she had become a hermit near the Aegean coast, living alone in a stone hut, writing patterns in sand that vanished with the tide. Others said she disappeared entirely, the sea taking her without struggle. When divers explored the coast near her last known home in modern times, they found fragments of bronze etched with faint rings, smoothed by salt water. The patterns were identical to the ones on Ion's record. It was as if the sea itself had continued his work. Today, scientists who study weather patterns near Delphi sometimes note an anomaly. During certain storms, the wind pauses for exactly 7 seconds before heavy rain begins. Sensors register it as silence, a measurable gap. But locals say that pause is Ion's hand hovering over parchment, waiting for the next word. The world may not believe in oracles anymore, but the rhythm remains. Some patterns never die. They simply stop needing interpreters. If you stand among the ruins at dusk, when the air grows still and the last tourists leave, you can still hear it. A faint scratching beneath the wind. Not thunder, not insects, not echoes. It sounds like a reed pen moving across paper. Perhaps Ion never stopped writing. Perhaps the world itself became his final archive. Every rainfall, every silence, every pause between words, a new scroll added to an endless jar. And maybe prophecy was never about knowing the future. Maybe it was only about recording the present carefully enough that it would repeat itself. Because the man who filed prophecies by hand did not preserve destiny. He preserved attention. And in a world that forgets to listen, that is the only prophecy worth keeping. The forgotten feasts of the dead in ancient Arcadia. In the high valleys of Arcadia, where the mist never lifts even at noon, there were once feasts held for the dead. Not solemn rituals or wailing processions, but real feasts. Tables, bread, wine, and laughter. They called them trapezi necron, the tables of the dead. Each autumn, when the fields turned gold and the air smelled of rain, the people of the valley would gather by the river Alpheos. They carried wooden tables on their shoulders, worn smooth by generations of use. They set them in long rows across the grass, facing east. Every family placed one empty chair at their table. That chair was not symbolic. It was for someone specific. They believed the dead came back to eat, not in body but in presence. Each breath of wind, each flicker of shadow, was a guest returning home for one meal. It was not fear that brought them together, but habit. To them, death was not a wall, only a quieter room in the same house. And once a year, the doors between those rooms opened. The Arcadians were not poets or priests. They did not speak of souls or judgment. They spoke of appetite. Even the dead must eat, they said. It was a practical truth. Each feast began before dawn. They slaughtered sheep, baked bread, poured wine, and set honey in small bowls for the children who had died too young. When the first light touched the river, they stopped talking. They sat still, heads bowed, waiting for the fog to move. The mist would shift slightly, just enough to show the outline of empty air where figures might have been. And then the feast began. They ate slowly, speaking to the chairs as if someone sat there. They asked questions, told stories, offered food. No one answered, but they never expected replies. The act itself was the prayer. A traveler once passing through called it madness. He wrote that the Arcadians dined with phantoms, but he stayed one night and changed his mind. At the moment when the fog touched his arm, he felt warmth, faint and human. He wrote later, "Their ghosts are not frightening, they are polite." The feast lasted until the sun reached its highest point. Then, as quietly as it began, it ended. They left the food on the tables and walked away without looking back. By evening, the plates were empty. No dogs, no birds, no insects touched the remains. Only the air seemed fed. No one knew how old the ritual was. The priests in Megalopolis said it predated the Olympian gods, that it belonged to a time when mortals and shades still shared the same fire. Others claimed it was a rebellion against Hades himself, a way to keep the dead near so they would not be forgotten. In one village, an old woman named Cleonike kept the oldest table. It was said to have belonged to her grandmother's grandmother. Its surface was carved with names, hundreds of them, scratched by hand over generations. She said it was how they kept lineage. When a name faded, she traced it again with a nail dipped in wine. "Names dry faster than blood," she said. One year the rains came early. The river flooded, washing away half the valley. Many died, and the survivors argued whether to hold the feast at all. Cleonike insisted. She said the dead would be hungry, so she set her table alone, knee-deep in mud. She lit a small fire and poured wine for those who could not return. The fog thickened. When it lifted, the plates were empty again. That was the year the custom spread. Villages that had abandoned the old rites began to hold their own feasts. Even soldiers returning from war laid out food for fallen comrades. They said it was easier than grief. But as centuries passed, the gods changed, and with them the rituals. The feasts became shorter, the food simpler. Soon only old women and children remembered the songs. The tables stayed empty all year, covered in dust. No one carved names anymore. Then came a priest from Corinth named Theon. He was young, educated, and certain that such customs were superstition. He traveled through Arcadia preaching that the dead belonged in the underworld, not at the table. He ordered the old tables burned. Most obeyed. Only Cleonike refused. He came to her hut, demanding she abandon her right. She smiled. "Do you eat alone, priest?" she asked. He said yes. She nodded. "That must be why your god never visits." Theon, unsettled, left without a word. That night, his horse refused to move near the river. He wrote in his journal, "The fog does not rise here, it waits." Months later, Cleonike died. Her hut collapsed in a storm. When villagers came to clear the debris, they found her table intact. No carvings, no names, only a faint warmth where her hands had rested. After that, no one dared destroy another table. They left them in the fields, weathered and unguarded. By the next generation, the feast returned. But something had changed. The people no longer believed the dead came to eat. They said instead that the tables fed the land, that every meal left in silence fertilized the soil, that the fog was only moisture, nothing more. But deep down, they still left one chair empty. And on some mornings, when the mist rolled in from the river, they swore they saw a hand lift a cup before it vanished again. No one recorded the last feast. No one needed to. The act itself became the memory. Even now, in those valleys where the fog never leaves, shepherds say they sometimes find smooth wooden boards buried under the grass. When touched, they feel faintly warm, as if a meal had only just ended. You wonder what would happen if the world stopped feeding its dead. Would silence grow where memory once sat? Would hunger move upward from the ground? The old feast grounds by the Alfeos slowly turned to marsh. The tables, once set beneath open sky, sank into the soft soil. By the next generation, the younger men plowed over them, planting barley where the dead once dined. No one thought it sacrilege. They said the ancestors had become part of the harvest. It sounded sensible, and sensibility always wins over mystery. But each year, when autumn came, the barley bent strangely in the wind. It leaned toward the east, in long ripples, as if bowing to something unseen. Farmers said it was weather. The elders said it was memory. In time, the valley forgot the feast entirely. The priests of the new gods built white altars on higher ground. They spoke of salvation, not supper. The old songs fell silent. The fog remained. 2 centuries later, an earthquake split the fields. The ground opened, swallowing part of the old river path. From the fissure rose the smell of damp wood and honey. When the villagers looked closer, they saw shapes half buried in clay, tables. Dozens of them, stacked upon one another like bones of a vanished generation. The carvings were still visible, names scratched in wine, now darkened to blood. The oldest among them, a shepherd named Damaris, remembered the stories. He touched one of the tables and whispered, "They've been waiting." He tried to tell the village that the earth was asking to be fed again. They laughed. They called it rot and superstition. But that winter the crops failed. Frost killed the barley. The wells ran sour. The fog thickened. Damaris, stubborn and poor, set one table again in the field. He placed bread, wine, and figs upon it. He left one cup empty. That night the fog rolled in as usual. But in the morning the bread was gone. The wine bowl was empty. The frost did not return. The neighbors mocked him at first. Then they saw his barley sprout green before theirs. By the next year, every farmer in the valley had rebuilt a table. They did not call it a feast. They said it was a precaution, but they left one chair empty just the same. Soon, even nearby towns began to copy the act. What had been religion became routine. Every autumn, food appeared on doorsteps, at crossroads, beside rivers. The people said it kept sickness away. They no longer spoke of the dead. They called it the offering to fog. But old customs have long memories. The offerings did not vanish randomly. They vanished in order. Bread first, then wine, then figs. The same sequence as the ancient feast. The dead were still eating, only no one wanted to admit it. One evening, a traveling scholar named Hagnon came through Arcadia. He was collecting strange rites for a book on forgotten rituals. When he asked the locals about the offerings, they shrugged. "It is for the fog," they said. He laughed. "Does the fog have a mouth?" No one answered. Hagnon decided to watch for himself. He set a table in the field just as they described. He poured wine, placed bread, and sat waiting with a lamp. Hours passed. The air grew colder. The fog thickened until he could not see his own hands. He heard soft footsteps, too light for animals, too even for the wind. The cup shifted. Something unseen took a sip. The air filled with the faint smell of myrrh. Hagnon did not run. He whispered, "Who eats?" A voice answered, almost kindly, "You do. We borrow your hunger." He felt no fear, only understanding. He realized the Arcadians had never fed the dead. They had fed themselves through remembrance. The act of setting the table kept the boundary thin enough for comfort. When they stopped, emptiness grew. The next morning, the villagers found Hagnon asleep beside the table. The food was gone. The cup was dry. His notes, scattered around him, were wet with dew and streaked with words he did not remember writing. We feed them to feed what will become us. He left the valley the next day, never publishing his book. But the villagers continued the custom quietly, year after year. They stopped explaining it. It needed no defense. In later centuries, travelers wrote of Arcadia's strange hospitality. How the people always left one plate untouched. How they never spoke loudly at dusk. How they smiled when fog rolled in. Superstition, they called it. Yet those who stayed a night swore they dreamed of feasts, of tables filled with both living and dead, all eating in silence. The dreams were never frightening. They were calm, precise, ordinary. And in the morning, the sleepers woke hungry, as if they had shared a real meal. By the modern age, the ritual vanished again. The fields turned to pastures. The tables rotted. Only the fog remained. But sometimes, after long rain, farmers plowing the soil would find smooth planks under their blades. When lifted, the wood was warm to the touch. They said it was the ground breathing. But old people still whispered that it was gratitude, the earth remembering its meal. Now and then, visitors to Arcadia notice how strangely the fog moves. Curls around empty benches, pauses over picnic tables. It lingers wherever food is shared in peace, as if looking for its seat. You wonder, if the living ever stopped feeding memory, what would take its place? Would hunger return in another form? Would the fog finally learn to speak? By the time the old ritual vanished, the valley no longer remembered it had ever been sacred. Roads crossed through it now. Villages had grown into small towns. The river was bridged, dammed, renamed, but the fog stayed. Even in the age of engines and iron, it rolled in every autumn, soft and heavy, as though carrying memory on its back. In 1923, a surveyor named Nicetas was sent to Arcadia to map new farmland. He was a practical man. He carried a compass, a ruler, and a small notebook. He believed only in what could be measured. On his second evening, while tracing boundary lines near the old Alfio's Bend, he saw something strange in the twilight. A pattern of rectangles beneath the grass, wood perfectly aligned, running for hundreds of meters. He thought it must have been an old storage site or maybe forgotten foundations. He marked the location and made camp. That night, the fog came early. It rose from the river like slow smoke, wrapping around his lantern. He heard faint sounds, cutlery, murmurs, the clink of cups. He thought it was the echo of water against stone. Then he noticed the smell. Baked bread, warm honey. Why? He stood and turned in a slow circle. There were no lights anywhere, no houses nearby, only fog. He called out, "Who's there?" The sound stopped. He sat again, writing the time, the temperature, the direction of wind. But when he looked back at the page, the pencil marks were gone. Only a faint grease stain remained, shaped like a hand. The next morning, he found something that puzzled him even more. His tin cup, left half full beside the fire, was empty. The ground around it was dry. A single crumb of bread rested beside it, though he had eaten none. He packed up and left quickly. Back in town, he mentioned it casually to an old innkeeper. The man nodded slowly. "They still eat here," he said. "The fog. It's hungry, same as us." Nicetas laughed. The innkeeper didn't. He stayed another week, mapping. Each night, he heard the same faint sounds. By the third night, he stopped pretending they were wind. He began leaving a little food out of habit. Bread, cheese, a slice of apple. By dawn, the food was always gone. and his compass needle spun strangely for an hour afterward. He started recording details in his notebook. 10:12 p.m., fog rises. 10:16, faint sound of laughter. 10:18, smell of wine, sweeter than grape. After the fifth night, he wrote nothing more. The last line read, "They're polite. They wait until I finish eating." When his superiors came weeks later to collect his maps, they found his tent collapsed and his tools untouched. The notebook was open beside a wooden plank buried in the soil. On the plank were shallow carvings, small names, faded, ancient. Someone had traced one name fresh in pencil: Cleonike. The officials assumed he had drowned in the river. They marked the site as dangerous and closed the file. Years passed. Locals avoided the bend. Children said that if you set a table there and left it overnight, the dishes would be clean by morning. A few tried. They never saw anything, but their bread always disappeared, and sometimes a new item appeared in return. An old coin, a wildflower, a piece of carved wood. A quiet trade continued between the living and whatever waited in the mist. Not worship, not fear, just an exchange. By the mid-20th century, the site was forgotten again. Modern life moved on, but whenever the fog thickened, drivers slowed their cars instinctively. They said the headlights dimmed, the engines softened, the air felt heavier. It was as if the world itself paused to remember a pattern it could not name. In the 1970s, a historian researching rural superstitions found mention of the feasts of the dead in Arcadia in a Roman account. He visited the valley, now overgrown and silent. In the mud, he found fragments of wood too smooth to be natural, their surfaces covered in faint lines. Under sunlight, the grain shimmered as if oil had soaked it recently. He took one piece home and left it on his desk. That night, it smelled faintly of bread. He began to suspect the Arcadians had never truly believed they were feeding ghosts. They were preserving time. Each meal, each offering, was a reminder that hunger connected the living to the dead, that appetite never dies, it only changes direction. The act of eating was continuity. To eat together, even across death, was to keep the world from collapsing into forgetfulness. He wrote a paper no one published. It ended with a single line: "When a people stop feeding their past, the fog begins to eat their future." Decades later, hikers found that same valley and described something they could not explain. They said that in the mist they saw the outlines of tables, wooden shapes half-formed in air. They felt warmth on their hands though the air was cold. They smelled bread, faint and fresh. One woman swore she saw her grandmother's shadow sitting at one of the empty chairs, smiling. She ran, but later said she regretted it. "It didn't want to scare me," she said. "It just wanted to be remembered." Now, when the fog rolls through Arcadia, locals stay indoors. But a few, the old ones, still set an extra plate at dinner. They do not tell their children why. They just nod toward the window and say, "The air is hungry tonight," and somewhere in that quiet valley, beneath layers of soil and memory, the old tables still rest, smooth, waiting, faintly warm. When the fog touches them, the wood hums like breath returning to the lungs. The dead do not ask for much, only a place at the table, only one meal shared in silence. Because even hunger, when remembered long enough, becomes prayer. How Hermes accidentally invented bureaucracy. Long before men invented paperwork, Hermes carried the first messages. He ran through clouds, between cities, across oceans, delivering words that could start wars or end them. He was quick, clever, and proud of his precision. The gods trusted him to remember every detail, and that trust became his punishment. At first, there were few messages to deliver. A warning from Zeus, a whisper from Aphrodite, a secret from Hades, sealed in darkness. Hermes delivered them all easily, his winged sandals flashing like light on water. But then mortals learned writing, and everything changed. No longer did a king send one message. He sent 20. He wanted them copied, sealed, and confirmed. Every city wanted proof that their words had been received. Every temple demanded signatures from the divine. Hermes became the god of errands. He hated it. One morning, he arrived on Olympus with his arms full of scrolls. Zeus barely looked up. "Place them on the cloud, Hermes." "Which cloud?" Hermes asked. "The proper one," said Zeus. That was the problem. There were no proper clouds anymore. They were all filled with records. He tried to organize them, at first by sender, then by destination, then by topic. Soon the sky looked like a filing cabinet, each scroll tied with colored ribbons, labeled by hand. The gods called it efficiency. Hermes called it tragedy. Still, he did his work. He created the first index of divine correspondence. Red ribbons for love affairs, blue for wars, gold for punishments, black for apologies. He even added a column for urgent requests, though no god ever agreed on what urgent meant. Then came the day he received 3 contradictory orders. Poseidon wanted rain, Demeter wanted sun, Zeus wanted balance. All 3 sealed their commands with the same date. Hermes froze. He had never disobeyed an order. But which one came first? Which seal outranked which? He tried to ask Zeus, but Zeus had gone hunting. He asked Athena, but she said, "You're the messenger. Decide." So Hermes made a list. He ranked the requests by importance. He issued a summary to each god, describing his choice. He signed it, approved by the Office of Divine Communication. The gods laughed. They thought it was a joke. But when the rains came at just the right time, they stopped laughing. Hermes's plan had worked. After that, every god wanted his approval. No one trusted their messages to move without his mark. He invented the seal to save himself from blame. He invented the signature to avoid confusion. He invented the duplicate copy to prevent arguments. By trying to make chaos neat, he created bureaucracy. Soon, other gods began demanding forms. Apollo wanted request slips for prayers. Demeter demanded seasonal schedules. Even Hades sent receipts for every soul he received. Hermes spent days sorting, filing, confirming. He ran not between worlds, but between desks. The once silent sky now rustled with parchment. He tried to delegate. He hired minor spirits to carry scrolls. They misunderstood everything. Messages meant for Sparta went to Samos. A warning for Odysseus ended up in a fisherman's net. A love poem for Hera reached Artemis, who returned it with a note labeled "Misdelivered Correspondence." Hermes realized that the problem was not communication. It was excess. The more words the gods used, the less they meant. Still, he couldn't stop. Once the system existed, it needed constant attention. He began building archives. He carved wooden shelves into the walls of Olympus, storing centuries of divine paperwork. He cross-referenced scrolls, created ledgers, and developed something new, a form with blank spaces for future requests. He called it a template. Athena was impressed. Zeus was relieved. The muses were horrified. "Order kills memory," they said. Hermes shrugged. "Memory kills accuracy." And so accuracy won. Over time, even mortals began to imitate him. Kings built halls of records. Scribes numbered documents. Merchants demanded receipts for offerings. Priests recorded every sacrifice with date and weight. One night, sitting among his endless shelves, Hermes looked down at the mortal world and saw towns filled with clerks, accountants, and record keepers, all of them his children in spirit. He felt no pride, only fatigue. He had built the world's first system of accountability, but he was now accountable to it himself. Every rule required another rule, every file another shelf. The process never ended. He thought of throwing it all away, burning the archives, releasing the messages back into the wind. But he hesitated. Without the records, how would the gods remember what they had promised? And if promises vanished, would order vanish too? He sighed, dipping his pen again. Every message, he muttered, is just another chain. The next morning, he delivered a sealed note to Zeus. It reads simply, "There are too many words. Approve fewer." Zeus never replied. He filed the message under general complaints. That was the first memo ever lost in divine history. It was also the first one ever copied, categorized, and archived. You wonder if Hermes knew then that he had trapped himself in his own invention. That once words demanded structure, no god or mortal would ever be free of it again. Hermes thought he could control it. He was wrong. Once the first archive opened, others followed. Every god wanted one. Ares built the Office of Tactical Declarations, where scribes recorded every battle before it began. Poseidon demanded a registry of currents, tracking tides by scroll and seal. Even Dionysus, who hated formality, started a department of festival scheduling. The gods joked that Olympus had become an empire of parchment, but they still obeyed the rules Hermes created. No request without documentation, no complaint without witness, no miracle without confirmation. Hermes tried to keep up. He installed drawers labeled by category: oaths, punishments, apologies, miscellaneous divine errands. He built ledgers, and copied the copies in case of theft or lightning. Soon, even the air above his desk was heavy with ink. He told himself it was progress. He told himself the world was finally organized. But deep down, he missed running. He remembered what it felt like to move through the sky, carrying words alive in his mouth, not written in black dust. Now the only movement he knew was shuffling papers. Still, order had a way of feeding itself. One day, a problem arose. 2 scrolls bore identical seals. One from Hera, one from Demeter, both urgent, both marked private divine matter. Hermes could not deliver either without knowing which came first. He invented a new concept to solve it, the timestamp. He wrote the exact time of writing on each document, dividing eternity into measurable pieces. It worked. The system celebrated him. For a brief moment, he felt brilliant again. But timestamps created something dangerous: comparison. Every god wanted to know whose command came first, whose message mattered more. Arguments erupted daily. The archives filled faster. The more order he added, the more confusion appeared. Hermes began to dream of empty skies. He would wake to the rustle of scrolls, the sound of dry parchment sliding like waves. It haunted him. He started losing track of what he had written and what he had only imagined. He asked Athena for advice. She said, "You have given the gods accountability, but not meaning." He frowned. "I gave them structure." "Yes," she said. "Structure is what gods invent when they fear silence." Her words stayed with him. He wondered if the whole system, the filing, the stamps, the ledgers, was his way of escaping silence too. Without constant motion, he might hear what the wind actually said. And that terrified him. Meanwhile, mortals imitated him more perfectly than the gods ever could. Cities filled with scribes who carried wax tablets instead of prayers. Merchants demanded written guarantees. Courts required multiple signatures. Even lovers began sending written vows instead of spoken ones. Hermes watched from above and realized he had created not efficiency, but distance. A city without paperwork could forget. A city with paperwork could never forgive. Every word lasted forever. One afternoon, he went to deliver a message to Hades. The Lord of the Dead looked up from his own desk, neat, quiet, immaculate. "You too?" Hermes asked. Hades smiled. "I keep records of every soul. If I didn't, the living would send them twice." Hermes laughed. Then Hades handed him a sheet of parchment. "Do you know what this is?" Hermes read it aloud. "Soul transfer request, Hermes, one pending." His heart froze. "My name?" "Yes," said Hades. "You're overworked. The paperwork of life itself has caught up to you." Hermes tried to tear it, but the parchment would not burn. Hades chuckled. "Relax, it's just procedure." That night, Hermes sat in his office and stared at the endless rows of files. He realized every god had his name somewhere inside. Every report ended with the same note, delivered by Hermes. His existence had become a signature. If he stopped, so would communication itself. The next day, he decided to test it. He refused to deliver anything for one sunrise. The effect was immediate. Messages piled up. Prayers bounced back. Omens failed to appear. Even thunder grew quiet. By midday, Zeus demanded an explanation. Hermes simply said, "System maintenance." The gods accepted it. They waited. In that quiet hour, the sky was still. No shuffling, no orders, no noise. Hermes felt light again. He flew once more, just for himself, through the empty clouds. For the first time in centuries, he carried nothing. He landed by the Aegean and sat on a cliff. He took out his stylus, not to record, but to think. He wondered what it would mean to let messages die naturally, to let meaning travel by memory again. But he knew it was impossible. Once you teach the world to document, it never stops. Even forgetting becomes a process. He returned to Olympus by sunset. The other gods were already panicking. Zeus waved a handful of scrolls at him. "Where have you been?" Hermes bowed. "Approving protocols." The god of messengers had learned the cruelest rule of all systems survive their creators. He sat at his desk again and wrote a new form, Notice of Necessary Chaos. He signed it but never sent it. He filed it under Someday. You wonder if bureaucracy ever began as control or only as fear, the fear that silence might expose how little the gods understood their own words. The archives of Olympus grew until they covered the clouds themselves. Scrolls hung from thunderbolts. Stacks of parchment floated in the sky, drifting like islands of ink. No one knew where anything was anymore, not even Hermes. He had built systems to make sense of chaos, and those systems had multiplied into their own kind of chaos, measured, numbered, polite. One morning, he found a scroll on his desk with no seal, no date, no name. He opened it. The parchment was blank except for one short line written in his own handwriting. "You are delivering this to yourself." He frowned. He had no memory of writing it. He searched the archives and found hundreds of similar scrolls, and signed messages addressed to no one, filed perfectly, stamped with invisible approval marks. They contained fragments of his own notes. "Do not forget the wind. Running is remembering. Systems replace faith." Each one was written in a slightly different style, as if by someone imitating him. He realized then that bureaucracy had learned to write itself. The scrolls no longer needed authors. Every time two records contradicted, the system created a third to reconcile them. Every contradiction birthed more paper. It was self-sustaining. Hermes watched as his clerks, spirits of ink and air, filed the new scrolls automatically. They did not look up. They did not think. They followed procedure. He whispered, "Stop." They didn't. The system did not hear commands anymore. It only heard requests properly formatted in triplicate. He sat at his desk and stared at his hands. They shook from years of writing. Ink had stained his skin permanently. He had once been the god of movement, of improvisation, of quick thinking. Now he was the god of process. Every miracle he had once carried now required documentation. He looked out over the clouds and saw gods waiting in line outside his office, holding forms. He had invented queuing. It was efficient. It was horrifying. Ares stood with folded arms, tapping his foot. Athena corrected a form behind him. Even Zeus held a scroll marked, pending approval. Hermes wanted to laugh, but no one else did. The system had replaced humor with procedure. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the world before writing. When messages were carried in voice, when memory was enough, when forgetting was forgiveness, when silence was not error. He could barely remember. He opened his desk drawer. Inside lay the only thing that still reminded him of that time. A small bronze tag marked Prototype Form 001. It was his first record, the one he had made to rank Poseidon's rain against Demeter's sun. The start of everything. He took it to the edge of Olympus. Below him, the clouds moved in organized rows. Even the wind seemed indexed. He held the bronze tag up to the light and whispered, "Enough." Then he let it fall. It tumbled through air, past layers of bureaucracy, past clouds shaped like filing cabinets, past the mountains. It struck the sea and sank. At that moment, something in the system hesitated. A small pause, a ripple in the rhythm of paperwork. One scroll remained unfinished on his desk. It waited for his signature. He did not sign it. He left it blank. The gods panicked. Zeus demanded an emergency session. The archives shook. The clerks froze. No one knew what to do with a document without a mark. For the first time in divine memory, the system encountered silence. That silence spread like contagion. Messages stopped mid-delivery. Orders went unanswered. No one died. Nothing broke. Everything simply paused. Hermes stood by his window and watched it unfold. The wind returned. The clouds drifted freely again. He realized then that bureaucracy was not his punishment. It was his fear of irrelevance made permanent. He had built it because he could not bear to trust the world to run without him. He walked away from his desk. He left the archives behind. No one noticed him go. He wandered the mortal world again, invisible, listening. Merchants argued over receipts. Kings debated treaties. Scribes copied laws. Everything he had invented still ruled them. But sometimes, when a child forgot a task and laughed, or when a farmer ignored a regulation and still planted, Hermes smiled. Defiance was still alive. He began to travel light again. No scrolls, no seals, no forms, only messages carried in breath. A whisper here, a thought there, a warning delivered by chance. He learned something new. Words written can be preserved. Words spoken can be forgiven. One day, long after Olympus itself faded from memory, a mortal found a rusted bronze tag on a beach. Its engraving had worn down, but one word remained. Approved. No one knew what it meant. They took it home and used it as a paperweight. It held down their letters, their receipts, their forms. And so bureaucracy lived on, quiet, invisible, inevitable. The god who once ran faster than sound now walked among the slowest creations of his own making. And maybe that was balance. Because every messenger, no matter how fast, eventually has to deliver the message that stops everything.